Autumn 1775. The world is on the brink of change. In North America, the spark of rebellion, ignited just months before at Lexington and Concord, is quickly becoming a raging fire. The 13 colonies are in open revolt against the mightiest empire on earth, Great Britain. At the head of this fledgling uprising is the newly formed Continental Army, commanded by General George Washington. Their cause seems righteous, but their chances of victory slim. Yet, in these early heady days of revolution, ambition and optimism run high. So high, in fact, that one audacious plan looks beyond the borders of the colonies, north to the vast frozen expanse of Canada. The strategic prize was the city of Quebec, the heart of British power in the region. If this fortress city could be captured, the revolutionaries believed, the French-speaking Canadians, who had only been under British rule for a little over a decade, might be convinced to join the rebellion. It would be a game-changing victory, adding a 14th colony to their cause and cutting off a major British route for invasion. The plan was as bold as it was dangerous, a two-pronged pincer movement designed to converge on Quebec and seize it before British reinforcements could arrive. Two commanders were chosen to lead this daring invasion. The first was General Richard Montgomery, an experienced and respected officer who had previously served in the British Army. He would lead his force north from the recently captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, following the well-established route through Lake Champlain and up the Richelieu River. His objective was to capture Montreal first, then advance down the St. Lawrence River to Quebec. The second prong of the attack was entrusted to a man whose name would one day become synonymous with treason, but who, in 1775, was one of the Continental Army's most aggressive and capable field commanders, Colonel Benedict Arnold. Arnold proposed a far more perilous route. He would lead a force of over 1,000 volunteers directly through the uncharted, unforgiving wilderness of Maine. This path, he argued, would be a complete surprise to the British. It was a high-risk, high-reward gamble, and Washington, desperate for a decisive victory, approved it. Montgomery's campaign began with relative success. He pushed north, capturing several British forts along the way. By November he had besieged and captured the city of Montreal, which had been left lightly defended. With a key Canadian city now in American hands, the path to Quebec seemed clear. But his victory came at a cost. Many of his soldiers, their enlistments expiring, simply went home, believing their job was done. Montgomery was left with a drastically smaller force to press on toward the ultimate prize. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles to the east, Benedict Arnold and his men were enduring a living nightmare. Their journey through the Maine wilderness became one of the most harrowing treks in American military history. They expected the journey to take about 3 weeks. It took over 2 months. Their specially built boats, or bateaux, were flimsy and poorly constructed, breaking apart in the fast, rocky rivers and costing them precious supplies. Icy autumn rains turned to snow and sleet. The men were constantly soaked, freezing, and exhausted. Their food ran out far sooner than anticipated. The soldiers were reduced to eating anything they could find, their leather shoes, cartridge boxes, even their pet dogs. Starvation, hypothermia, and diseases like smallpox ravaged the column. Of the 1,100 men who started with Arnold, nearly 500 either died, deserted, or were forced to turn back. It was a testament to Arnold's incredible leadership and the sheer willpower of his men that any of them survived at all. In early November, a skeletal force of just over 600 men, looking more like ghosts than soldiers, finally emerged from the wilderness and stumbled onto the southern shore of the St. Lawrence River, within sight of the walls of Quebec. Inside the city, the British governor of Canada, Guy Carleton, was a man under pressure. He was a skilled and experienced general, but his forces were stretched thin. He had only a small number of regular British troops, relying heavily on local Canadian militia whose loyalty was uncertain. When he learned of Montgomery's capture of Montreal and Arnold's surprise appearance, he raced back to Quebec to organize its defense. He worked tirelessly, reinforcing the city's formidable stone walls and rallying the citizens. Carleton knew that if he could just hold out until spring, the Royal Navy would arrive with thousands of reinforcements. His strategy was simple: survive the winter. By early December, Montgomery's small army arrived from Montreal and linked up with Arnold's battered troops. Together, they now had about 1,000 men, a force barely larger than the city's defenders. They were ill-equipped for a long siege in the brutal Canadian winter. Their clothes were in tatters, their food was scarce, and smallpox was still spreading through their ranks. Worse still, the enlistments for many of Arnold's men were set to expire at the end of the year. Time was running out. Montgomery and Arnold knew they had to launch a decisive attack, and it had to be soon. Their plan was desperate. They would wait for the cover of a snowstorm and then launch a surprise two-pronged assault on the lower town, the commercial section of Quebec that lay outside the main fortress walls. Montgomery would lead one attack from the south, while Arnold would lead another from the north. If they could capture the lower town, they believed Carleton would be forced to surrender the entire city. The fate of Canada, and perhaps the revolution itself, would be decided in a single, frantic assault. On the night of December 30th, the weather turned. A blizzard began to rage, whipping snow and wind through the narrow streets of Quebec. It was the moment they had been waiting for. In the pre-dawn darkness of December 31st, 1775, the American attack began. Under the cloak of the swirling snow, the two American columns advanced. Montgomery personally led his men along a narrow path at the base of the cliffs. As they approached the first wooden barricade, they were spotted. A blast of grape shot and musket fire erupted from a fortified house. General Richard Montgomery, at the very front of the charge, was struck and killed instantly, along with several of his senior officers. With their leader gone, the southern attack faltered and then collapsed into a panicked retreat. On the other side of the lower town, Benedict Arnold's column was having more initial success. They pushed through the northern barricades, but the fighting was fierce and chaotic. In the confusion, Arnold was hit by a musket ball that shattered his leg. He was carried, bleeding and furious, to the rear. Command fell to Captain Daniel Morgan, a tough Virginian frontiersman. Morgan rallied the men and they pressed on, fighting house to house through the narrow streets. But without Arnold, and with Montgomery's attack having failed completely, they were now alone, deep inside the enemy's defenses. Governor Carleton, seeing the southern attack had been repulsed, was able to shift his troops to surround Morgan's isolated force. For hours, the Americans fought bravely, trapped in the maze of streets as British soldiers and militia closed in from all sides. But they were outnumbered, their gunpowder was wet from the snow, and their leaders were either dead or wounded. Finally, with no hope of reinforcement or escape, Morgan and his surviving men were forced to surrender. The Battle of Quebec was an unmitigated disaster for the Continental Army. Over 60 Americans were killed or wounded, and more than 400 were taken prisoner. The British, fighting from behind their strong defenses, suffered fewer than 20 casualties. The dream of a 14th colony joining the revolution died that snowy morning in the streets of Quebec. Though wounded, Benedict Arnold refused to give up. With the few hundred men who had not been killed or captured, he established a weak and largely symbolic siege of the city throughout the rest of the winter. But his small force was starving, freezing, and plagued by disease. When spring finally arrived in May 1776, it wasn't American reinforcements that appeared on the St. Lawrence River, but the sails of the British Royal Navy. With thousands of fresh British and Hessian troops pouring into Canada, the American position became completely untenable. The surviving Continentals began a long, painful retreat back to New York, harried by British forces the entire way. The invasion of Canada was officially over. The failed campaign was the first major defeat for the Continental Army, and it carried several important lessons. It starkly revealed the limits of American military power and resources in the early stages of the war. It demonstrated that ambition and courage alone were not enough to overcome logistical challenges, harsh weather, and fortified positions. Most significantly, it ended any realistic hope of Canada joining the American cause. Quebec would remain a secure British base of operations for the remainder of the war. Yet, even in this crushing defeat, there was a glimmer of something powerful. The incredible endurance of Arnold's men on their march through Maine, and their ferocity in the final assault, proved that the American soldier was a determined and formidable foe. The Battle of Quebec was a bitter lesson in the harsh realities of war, a reminder that the path to liberty would be long, bloody, and filled with sacrifice. It was a frozen, desperate gamble at the very edge of the revolution, a bold plan that ended in a bitter defeat, but one that forged the spirit of an army that would, against all odds, fight on.